All right, section 3 of chapter 11 here. We're going to be talking about other mechanisms of evolution, and our objectives are going to be to talk about and explain how gene flow, genetic drift, and sexual selection can lead to the evolution of populations. So, we're going to talk about gene flow, genetic drift, and sexual selection. All right, so first we need a couple definitions, right? Gene flow is the movement of alleles from one population to another. And what you need to understand about this is if you have population A and you got population B over here, individuals that leave A and enter B, they're taking away from the gene pool of A and adding to the gene pool of B, right? And vice versa. You could have flow in the opposite direction, population B, individuals can leave and enter A. So gene flow is moving those alleles back and forth from one population to another, right? And as long as you have these neighboring populations, gene flow tends to keep those populations similar to each other, because as long as they're moving back and forth, right, those genes from one and the genes from the other keep mixing together and they stay pretty much the same. Right? It's only a lack of gene flow that could actually cause those two populations to become different from each other. Right? So again, we talked about a long time ago, maybe A is the mainland and B is an island in the middle of the ocean. If I can't get from A to B, if I cut off that flow from one population to another, those populations now can start to change from each other. Since they're isolated, population A and B can start to differentiate, right? The environment on island B is a little different than the environment on the mainland. That's why Darwin saw differences between the mockingbirds in the Galapagos versus the mockingbirds on the mainland. So it's all about whether this occurs or not, but gene flow prevents evolution, right? It keeps those populations the same. It's a lack of gene flow that will help them to differentiate from each other. Evolution can only occur when you cut off that gene flow. So I need to remove this. I need to remove this in order for that evolution to occur. That's when they're going to start changing. Otherwise, genetic drift is a whole different topic. It has a little bit to do with gene flow, but these are changes in allele frequencies that are due to chance and only due to chance. Right? So they're completely random changes. There's nothing that's causing one thing or another to become more frequently occurring, but there's a couple different types of genetic drift that we have to deal with. And either way, we're talking about decreasing a population size, because there's lots of different examples for that. Right? If I have a deck of cards, I have 4 different suits, right? 2 different colors, black and red. I got, 13 different cards, ace through king, right? I have lots of diversity in a deck of cards. There's lots of different traits, right? If each of those different numbers and each of those different suits represents some kind of trait, I have a lot of diversity there. But if I decrease the population size, if I just draw 5 cards out of the deck, right, it's actually pretty rare to have everything still present, right? I can't possibly have all 13 different kinds of cards. I can't have an ace, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way through king, right? Because I only have 5 cards. So you're automatically going to lose certain traits in that example, and you're going to possibly increase the frequency of other things at the same time, because when you draw that 5-card hand, you might have a pair, you might have 3 of a kind, right? And that actually means that all of a sudden, right, you got 3 kings, right, when you're really only supposed to have 4 kings in an entire deck of 52 cards. So It's all about the population size. When you decrease that population size some way, somehow, random chance causes things to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Right? So the two types of genetic drift are bottleneck effect and founder effect. And there's just two different ways for that to occur. Bottleneck effect, fairly simple, right? You have a population size that's greatly reduced some way, somehow, and then it tries to rebound, but because of that decrease in that gene pool size, because you're going to lose so many different traits, those species are then going to suffer a little bit, right? So a cheetah is an example of an organism that has suffered from this bottleneck effect. So something has to happen to kill a lot of the population, decrease that population to a very small size, right? And what's happening for the cheetahs is we're destroying their environments, right? They don't have anywhere to live or food to eat. So they're dying off rapidly. But now it's gotten to the point where there's so few cheetahs left, right? There's less than 1,000 cheetahs left in the world, right? That means that there's not going to be as much genetic diversity, and they're going to have a really hard time adapting to that change that's still happening in their environment. So any species, right, that is or ever has been on that endangered list, right, they're experiencing the bottleneck effect. So again, you have to have a very small amount left, right? So maybe there were only under 1,000 bald eagles left, but they can rebound. You could end up with a lot more after that, but because you reduce that population size so much at one point, it's unlikely that they'll have a huge diversity of traits left over, and that's going to affect them in the long run. So bottleneck effect, right? Lots of the species die off. There's only a few left. They have less genes because of it. Founder effect is a little bit different. This is when you say you have a new population, right? You have a small number of individuals that are moving to a different area. So this doesn't affect the population as a whole worldwide, but it does affect the population in a specific area. So when you have a small number of individuals that colonize a new area, remember when you have a few birds that are flown off course and they end up flying from A to B, they're stuck on this island in the middle of the ocean now, right? It's possible that already you have reduced that number of traits that could be in existence. So the big thing there is not so much that the species is going to go extinct, but for this specific population over here on the island B, you might have these rare traits in the main population that are much more common now, right? So one of the examples from the book they talk about, right, are groups of people that have moved from one place to another, displaced from one place to another, right? Something rare can become more common very easily, right? So if you happen to have 5 people that move from A to B and 3 of them have red hair, all of a sudden that's not a very rare trait anymore. It's a really common trait for that population. I was just checking in the book real quick, but they talked about an Amish population that has a rare form of dwarfism that is very, very common, right? So just because they secluded themselves, they didn't even have to move to a new area. Seclusion of a population can make something that should be very rare become very much more common in that population. So both of those things occur for the same reason. They're both types of genetic drift, but bottleneck effect, you lost a lot of the population, and that's why there's a smaller gene pool to work with. Founder effect, you just isolated a population, but they still have the same issues, right? They have a smaller number of genes to work with now, and sometimes things that are rare become much more common, right? And you lose other traits that the main population has. So then when we look at some questions with this, the idea is to think about, well, would a population of 10 or 100 individuals be more vulnerable to genetic drift? So again, when I look at the examples for genetic drift. I got bottleneck effect, I got founder effect, right? If you only have 10 cheetahs left, that means you're going to have way less diversity than even the 100 cheetahs, right? Even dropping below 1,000 was a bad thing. So smaller is always worse, right? The smaller the population gets, the smaller the diversity of that population in the long run. So as the population decreases, the diversity also increases or decreases, so that's always going to be a bad thing. 10 is worse than 100. The next one, which type of genetic drift most likely affects bald eagles, an endangered species? Again, you should know that. I just said that on the last slide. And I even wrote endangered right there. So I'm guessing the answer is probably bottleneck effect. So then this next slide starts talking about the sexual selection. And so all three of these things are slightly different. Don't really connect them all together, right? Gene flow, genetic drift, and sexual selection are all their own thing. The sexual selection has to do with the fact, as this lists here, that the cost of reproduction is always going to be different for males and females, right? Just by definition, the cost for a male versus the cost of a female is going to be very different, right? Males can produce many sperm continuously, so reproduction has little cost for them, right? Whereas females produce a much more limited amount of offspring, so each investment is going to cost them so much more, right? There's a reason why females are going to be choosy in any population, right? Because they're only going to have a few offspring, and they need to make sure that those offspring have traits that are going to help them survive. So when we're talking about selection in the animal world, right, the reason why females are choosy is because they're worried about their offspring surviving, right? So they're looking for traits that would indicate that that male is fit, that it's capable of surviving in its environment. But it has to do with the fact that they have so much more limited opportunities for that mating, right, and actually producing offspring. So sexual selection is when certain traits can increase the reproductive success and are selected for. We have different kinds of examples for that. Sometimes it's direct competition between males. So if that's the case, say with deer, right, bucks are going to actually fight with each other to earn the right to mate. So sometimes it has to do with being bigger and stronger. You can fight, and that directly indicates your fitness, because the stronger the deer, the more likely it is to survive. That actually makes sense. But then there's some other traits that are actually meant to attract females. So when we use examples like the lazuli bunting, sometimes you're going to use color, right? Bright and colorful feathers can attract females, right? They don't necessarily make that male more likely to survive, which is kind of strange, but it does increase the reproductive opportunities for that male, so it's considered something that's sexually selected for. So you have two different kinds of examples here. You got those bucks in rut, and you got color, right? That lazuli bunting. Right? The brighter blue the feathers, the more offspring that male is going to have, right? Again, females have the choice, and if they like blue feathers, then they like blue feathers. It is what it is. The deer one makes sense in other terms of fitness, but a lot of times it comes down to just little things. So this next slide is talking about sexually selected traits and how they increase the fitness of an individual, but that does not mean that they help the individual survive, right? So we already have an example for this. You have to come up with your own example for this, right? I just told you that, and we just learned about how bright blue lazuli bunting birds, not only are they less likely to survive because they can't hide from their predators, but they're also going to be picked on by the older lazuli bunting birds and might not survive because of that. So it's due to predators and due to competition in this case, which is actually fairly rare, but they're not going to be more likely to survive, but they're much more likely to have more offspring, which is the trade-off. That's the idea. So this is my example. You cannot use this example on your quiz, so try and come up with something that would work like this. There's lots of examples, especially with birds. So if you want to stick in that area, that's fine. But you got to come up with your own unique example for a quiz or a test. I won't let you use mine. Otherwise, that's it for today. You got to watch a quiz to go with these notes, or excuse me, you have to complete a quiz to go with these notes. But that's it for the